Hello. I'm so glad you decided to join me on the grand tour. It'd be so much more fun with friends. And so here we are at Dover, ready to embark. And today's novel is by another traveller on the grand tour, Parson Yorick, who we met in Laurence Sterne's Tristram Shandy from a few months back. Now, this time Parson Yorick gets his own novel, which is The Sentimental Journey Through France and Italy, though he doesn't get very far in his sentimental journey because poor old Laurence Sterne, his health was never terribly good, died before he could finish it. And then his body got stolen by the anatomists and was recognised on the table, apparently. So that is why this is a very, very short book, and why it's perfectly good for the 20-mile cross the channel into France, where we will start with French books. But we're doing a sentimental journey. So a sentimental journey is Sterne really responding, like any good writer, to the changes in fashion in writing. Of course, any good writer would like to make money out of their writing, and the writing of his earlier works, the early books of Tristram Shandy, which up to about book 6 are very Scribalian. They are bawdy humour, they are deeply, deeply satirical. Books 7, 8, 9, the last few books are starting to become sentimental because books 5 and 6 didn't sell terribly well, which he complains about in Tristram Shandy. Tristram complains that the books haven't sold very well. He starts to move into a sentimental mode, which had become immensely popular at this time, this mid-1860s period, and moves into later periods. Really, it's probably a good way to think about the sentimental as being proto-romantic in some ways. And in Germany, you get another movement, which we will have a look at when we go to Germany, which is called Sturm und Drang, which is also a proto-romantic. Remember, this is a world where Rousseau is writing his, what's it called? But anyway, his work on the authentic rather than the civilized human. And so we are getting this idea of nature and emotion and individuality. This is really an individualization of the world, is with the sentimental literature. A sentimental literature is incredibly, incredibly hard to write well, because last month's story, Mary, was Mary Wollstonecraft attempting a sentimental novel, 62 pages of it. And this proves to be rather difficult she proved how difficult they are to write by the fact that her heroine is so freaking obnoxious that you don't want to spend any time with her. Yes, she feels everything deeply, but since when did feeling everything deeply become a virtue? Well, in the mid-18th century, feeling deeply became a virtue. Or it was a form of virtue. It relates to the individualization of society and the fact that we are starting to go from a very collective ideal, which is where we get earlier literature, plays, poetry, theatre, opera, all of these things coming out. And then novels. Remember when I spoke about novels at the very, very beginning, I talked about this being an individualization of literature, individual voices and voices not attached to the classical era. So we're not going backwards to the classical era, we're looking forwards. to this modernised world. And this is a world that Swift was satirising, that Fielding had a go at, that Sterne himself had a go at in Tristram Shandy. And Sterne, although he is writing a sentimental novel, is actually has a foot in either camp. He does stretch it and point out this concept has its limitations. It is not going to work all the time. It's not a catch-all to replace duty and loyalty and all these other things that have gone before. So it's really it's a very interesting idea. So sentimental literature, what is it defined as? Well, vignettes of felt benevolence and emotionally fragmented syntax. So you get lots of dashes, which you definitely see with Yorick. Yorick writes with lots of little dashes in, as though overcome with the emotion, he couldn't finish the sentence. Deeply felt emotion is very, very important for the sentimental novel. It has wordless recognition of sympathetic mutuality and a consolatory exchange of tears. There's lots of crying in these books. So the upset person will cry, and then the sentimental writer will cry along with them. Sterne, although this is meant to be seen as a virtue and finer and a recognition of higher spiritual understanding, Sterne also is quite cynical enough to say, well, yes, there is desire underneath this, because these are generally male narrators crying along with poor, defenceless maidens. Yes, we all know what they would like to do there. Especially as these poor, defenceless maidens are often of the lower classes, so therefore quite eligible for a little fornication from a gentleman, much like Tom Jones. So it's sort of a Tom Jones with less good-naturedness and more, oh yes, I totally understand. I'm totally with you. It's a bit of an emo Tom Jones. Think of it like that. A bit of an emo Tom Jones. There is a pathology of nervous response and disorder debilitating in the face of grief. So you see that with Mary in the last video. Just completely collapses psychically in the face of grief or a strong emotion. You have the value of, or you have an understanding of virtue, personal identity, and human society that places the capacity for exquisite feeling at its centre. Now, what this does is basically, if you have fine feelings, which is what Mary continually insists, which makes it so very, very dull, and Yorick is all about his fine feelings, even though his fine feelings may also travel to his trousers or his breeches a little bit. Not that Parson Yorick fornicates. Tristram fornicates. But not that Parson Yorick fornicates, but that one is constantly aware that although he may talk of his heart, something a little lower in his anatomy is also being stimulated. The value of a person becomes dependent on their capacity for exquisite feeling, which is one of the problems with sentimental literature. And it's something that Sterne is, poking at. This idea that you are valuable only if you have exquisite feeling. And that exquisite feeling is not the be-all and end-all to actually acting, because Yorick has exquisite feelings frequently, but doesn't always act on them. He will very much give alms to beggars based on how they make him feel. Not their desserts, but how they make him feel. He will indulge in sort of a pornography of feeling and then go to dinner. So the idea of framing your moral world around exquisite feeling has its limitations. It excludes others, people who don't have time for exquisite feelings. Just as ladies have time for the vapours. Their working class maids do not have time for vapours, and they just have to keep going no matter how much whatever is going on in their life is happening. So the working class don't have time for exquisite feeling. They are just trying to eat. So they become other. They are not worthy, they are not virtuous because they don't have this exquisite feeling. Another group that are excluded from this, which is very, very important and which was a very, very big criticism of sentimentality, is slaves. Slaves who are seen as far less than human and use this. The abolitionists complain that all this exquisite feeling is useless if you are still eating sugar, if you are still benefiting from the labour and the enslavement of other human beings. That this, you can feel all as exquisite as you like, but you don't get the moral high ground. So lack of action is something that is highly criticised in this form of writing. So sentimentality is also in direct opposition to the more rational, stoic exemplars of earlier in the century. So someone like Swift, who is absolutely having a go at the individualization and the I am so great, I'm the self-made man of Gulliver's Travels, or the idea of that continuation that you see in, a lot of other earlier writers, that continuation of a culture across time, that's missing from sentimental works. A person's value is based on their sentiment, not on their existing within a continuum. And so instead, it's a beginning of individualization, moving from that really collective culture to a much more individualized culture that we see today. So why is this an important book to read as a writer? Why would you read sentimental literature? Because sentimental literature is quite cloying. It feels performative on the part of the narrator. It's not fashionable. It's most definitely not fashionable. It can sound a little bit like listening to someone whine. So why would we want to read this? Well, it's quite interesting because as a writer, you are using a thing called empathy. And novels are empathy. They bring empathy into overdrive. From the 18th century, through the 19th century, through to today, but definitely in the 18th and 19th century, as literacy and reading became a much, much, much more common practice, you see empathy becoming a broader emotion. A healthy adult develops empathy. Empathy is the thing that stops you killing your baby when it has woken you up for the 5th time that night, basically. It is the thing that puts you into that position where you can be a parent. You can put something else ahead of yourself. Now, that has always existed, but it's existed on a much smaller scale. It's existed in the family. It's been, you don't kill your children because you care about them, So this it's been linked only to class. So people of your own class deserve empathy, people of your own little world What novels do, novels allow you to see the world from another person's point of view. Novels are empathy engines. They are so important in developing empathy. And it's no coincidence that things that had gone completely unnoticed, that had been just considered, that's the way of the world, like slavery, like very poor working conditions, like the disenfranchisement of women and the disenfranchisement of working people. All of these things, the animal cruelty, all of these things start to develop in this period and into the 19th century. We see the abolition of slavery. We see the gaining of voting rights. We see for men and then for women in Australia. England took, the rest of the world took ages. They needed persuading the sky wouldn't fall. Even Barton, Australia's first Prime Minister, went to England with some Australian suffragettes to say, hey, we've done this, the sky didn't fall in, maybe you should try it. But, so you see the development of things like the RSPCA, you see the development of trade unions, you see these developments that improve the lot of a lot of people. That happens with empathy. A great manipulator of empathy was Dickens. All of those socially progressive writers of the 19th century are empathy generators. They make you feel for some pathetic little wastrel and then you go and like, oh, maybe we ought to look after them. That is where this is coming from. And to understand sentimental literature, you really need to look at it in terms of that empathy development. So there are 3 levels of empathy. There is cognitive empathy, which is the ability to intellectually understand the emotional responses of others. Everyone can do this, even psychopaths. That's how they get what they want. It's a really cold kind of empathy, and it allows bullies to manipulate their victims, to not feel what they're doing to their victim, but to know if I push this button, I get this response. If you are a writer, this is the kind of empathy you want to be using when you write. You want to use this kind of empathy because this kind of empathy is the one that knows I push button A, my reader will do this. Okay, so this is a really useful kind of empathy. The second kind of empathy, which is where sentimental literature fits in, this is a more developed kind of empathy. This is called affective empathy, and this is what uses mirror neurons. So this is the ability to have a mirrored emotional response to others. Start to sound like sentimental literature? To respond not in sympathy, but in empathy. They didn't have the word. They use sympathy a lot in these books, but really it's empathy, and it's affective empathy. It's feeling what another person is feeling. It stops you being a psychopath because you don't go and kill that person because, oh yeah, that'd be bad. That'd feel bad. It's the thing that makes you feel bad when you hurt someone. So that's affective empathy. Sentimental literature sort of makes this a bit porny, emotional porn, because the idea of a sentimental literature is to overdose on this. But if this is a new thing, it's kind of like, for the sentimental writer, it's kind of like taking heroin. You need bigger and bigger jots every time you take it. So that's part of the reason why this is so cloying to a modern audience, because this isn't a new and shiny thing to us. We're used to this. So this can feel quite cloying to a modern audience. But, Sentimental Journey, it's only about 100 pages long. You can cope. You can cope. It's also quite funny and it undercuts it, which makes it far more readable than most sentimental novels. And finally, there is empathetic concern. And this is where the sentimental literature misses out. And this is where the abolitionists and critics of it have a point. Empathetic concern is where your feelings drive you to action to change. So what they are doing as you get all these feelings, and then you think, you know what? That's kind of bad. How about we put our time and money and effort into making sure nobody else suffers like this? And Sterne satirizes the sentimental, what is effective empathy, and its inability to do this, to move to this, when he looks at the little book, or the little chapter, The Captive, where Yorick attempts to think about what it would be like to be enslaved, but finds that it's far too uncomfortable and he'd rather go and have dinner because it's just too, it's too much for him. He's overwhelmed by it. Now, he can only really do it for himself. He can't feel that same sympathy, that same empathy for another. So that's something that Sterne manages to satirize in this. Sterne essentially gets to have his cake and eat it too. He's got a foot in both camps. He's both rational and satirical, but he's also writing for this audience that is demanding sentimental. Nature also comes up very strongly in this, which will come up later with the Romantics as a huge topic. Nature and what is human nature versus what is rarefied and civilized, over the top. So those ideas that Rousseau talks about are coming through in sentimental literature. So that's a sentimental journey. Next month, we're going to be in France, and the book we are going to be looking at is Les Liaisons Dangereuses. And I can't pronounce the author's name, so I'm not even going to try. But Dangerous Liaisons in English. There will be a link down below to an ebook from Project Gutenberg so that you can read along with us. And until we meet again, bon voyage, and I will see you in Paris.